we're here tonight to talk about the science. And for me, science is just asking questions. I hadn't really thought about it in a while. I loved science when I was younger, but it's been a while since I thought, you know, I've heard this, follow the science, follow the science. I hate that phrase, by the way. But to do this with the lads, I was thinking, what does science mean? So to me, it's asking questions with no preconceptions about what you're going to find, constantly observing and constantly looking for more questions. And that's really been my journey as a rebel as well, because, you know, social science, to me, when I was younger, it all felt a bit floppy, you know, that wasn't, but it's really a genuine scientific discipline, in my view now. You have to keep asking questions, talking to people and observing. So tonight we've got these really brave scientists coming in to try and ask some of these questions that they've been asking themselves. You know, that's why they're here. And scientists have to try and be impartial, but to be a scientist in rebellion, you have to connect with the emotion of that, and then you have to connect with other people, and then we go out there. So that's what we're here for tonight. Let's get going with the questions. Oh no, we're not going to get going with the questions. We're going to introduce the lads who were brave enough to come here tonight. So Zach, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Zach. I'm an undergraduate biologist at Oxford, and I'm studying biology with a preference for plant sciences and extinction events. I'll pass it on to Mike.
Hey, I'm Mike. In a past life, I was a theoretical physicist. I did my undergrad at UCL, and then I started a PhD at St Andrews, but then I dropped out 2 years in because of climate grief. I wasn't studying anything related to the climate, I will be honest, but I've experienced like scientific community and how it operates. And I've been a rebel ever since. So?
Yeah, hi everyone. Similar-ish to Mike, my background's in astrophysics. I am still an astrophysicist, a researcher in Chile working remotely. Pretty much now doing that in my spare time and doing activism most of the time. Yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Tim. And I just want to speak to that because, you know, people say that to me, if you've got the kind of brain that can take you into any field of science, you know, I think, you know, you've got the skills, the abilities to follow any kind, and it's about then looking into it, you know, somebody who can do maths, if they can do trigonometry, I'm going to assume they can do quadratic equations, you know, it's not, yeah, don't get hung up on that. And we all need to be asking these questions at the moment. So first question, Gio?
What would you say are the most important facts that we should be getting out?
That's a really great question, and there's a lot of opinion that goes into that, because you know what science can do is it can direct, it can inform your decisions about the world, but it doesn't tell you what is right or wrong in terms of what you believe about the world. And so when you say what's the most important thing to know, that's really a value judgment. So to me, I would just give, I think there are two stats which I would try and highlight as perhaps the most important in my view. First, it's estimated that climate tipping points exist around about 1 to 3 degrees centigrade above industrial averages, pre-industrial averages, and we're already beyond 1 degree. I'll explain what that means in a bit more detail in a second. The second fact, I think, is that billions of people are threatened by starvation, drought, displacement, and inundation in the next few decades. So I think that sets a political scene quite well, which is why they're so important. So first on that question of tipping points, why is that so important? Basically, tipping points, some people will know, some people won't know, are they are points within the system, the climate system itself, where kind of reinforcing natural mechanisms start to strip humanity of any control. It means you get run away without any additional influence from humans. So kind of a tip is the ice. As the ice melts, less of the solar radiation is reflected into space, and so the Earth warms up faster, which it melts the ice faster, which reduces that reflectivity again, and so the Earth warms faster still. So you get that kind of runaway process of warming. Just needs something to kick it going, and then it's kind of self-fulfilling. So to me, the fact that we might already be crossing that threshold, and there are some signs that we are, that tells us how urgent it's so extremely important fact in why we have to act now, because we might not get another chance. On the second point, that's a much more humanistic perspective. Billions are threatened. Just consider that for a moment. Billions of people threatened by starvation, billions more by displacement, forced out of their homes. So first, I mean, there's two things that I really want to link that to. First is that firstly, let's try and ground it in something that is quite understood, quite seen, something that you can see in the real world already. And that would be the example of the Syrian civil war. A lot of people don't recognize that the Syrian civil war can largely be attributed to climate change. It was preceded by the worst drought in the region in record, in hundreds of years, in all likelihood. And the knock-on consequences of that are really exemplary of what we mean by climate breakdown and social breakdown. Because what you had there was about 5 million people were displaced because of that war and that drought. And the effect on the world was enormous. I mean, we saw far-right authoritarian surge across the world as a consequence of just 5 million refugees. But what we're looking at in the future, in the next few decades, if we don't sort this out, are billions of refugees. Second of all, this I think is quite a UK-based audience, and often we talk about climate change as if it's something that is happening out there and happening to other people, which there's truth to that. There are people who are more vulnerable than others, but I think it's worth mentioning that at the current rate, we're looking at about 3 million British people displaced by rising seas by 2050. So enormous refugee crisis within our own borders. And then to touch on the kind of issue of starvation and drought, again, that's something that has a really global effect. We have globalized food networks, we have globalized systems of distribution. And that means that if you have enormous agricultural failures in one part of the world, that can affect the world everywhere. And the kind of pressures that puts on onto other systems in both political senses and physically are enormous and have to be considered and understood as such. So to me, I think those are the kind of most important facts that I always like to try and emphasize. But I'm curious what Mike and Zach would choose as well.
So I had no idea about that Syrian refugee. I hadn't made that connection. That's about asking the right questions, isn't it? Yeah, Zach.
I'll be quick here, but I think one really important thing for me is the need to act now and not focus on these targets of 2030 or 2040 or 2050, because I mean, the climate system has massive inertia. So, you can put, billions tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but the effect of that, will continue long beyond putting out new emissions. So like if we stopped all of our emissions now, there's going to be no significant effect on warming over the next 2 decades. We're still going to see warming occurring just from that massive backlog of all the carbon that we've put into the atmosphere thus far. And that's why I find things like 2050 targets really dangerous, because it kind of suggests that we don't have to act now, or we can just, linearly reduce our emissions. But it's really that's really, really dangerous. And if we linearly reduced our emissions from now to 2050, which we're not seeing, we're still seeing an increase, but even if we did linearly decrease, we're going to run out of our carbon budget in about 4 years for 1.5 degrees. So I think that's really the most important thing that I'd like to share, is the fact that, the climate system, takes a long time to respond to all of the effects. And we can already see how rapidly the climate is changing. So yeah, that would be what I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And I think, that's a point we need to listen to our youth about. To me, 2050 feels a long way off. 2020, I didn't even realise was 20 years the other day. I thought, oh, that wasn't long ago. No, it was 20 years ago. And so, as much as I'm trying to live in that and know that it's present, I don't think it is as much the older that we get, if I'm honest, because it feels that much further away. Thank you. Mike.
Hey, yeah, I think there's 2 points that I would kind of like people to know. One is the first one's like a general meta point about the science. Almost many of the predictions have been too optimistic. We consistently see that we think it's going to be this bad in this much time, and it was worse. It's almost always worse. And that's not by chance. That's not just oh, why is that happening? The reason that's happening is, there's a few, but one of them, for instance, is scientists by their nature are very conservative. And they kind of like to group their results around each other. So if people are saying, oh, I think it's some number, then everyone kind of, no one wants to be the one that says, oh, wait, holy shit, maybe it's actually terrible. So even when doing non-climate related things, you see this in science where scientists should have got to a figure better, but because they are humans and animals, they are not as good and kind of as rational, independent thinkers as we'd like to believe. There's also, there's a very widespread and I think incredibly dangerous, spectacularly dangerous view in the scientific community that it is, quote, and I hear this all the time, counterproductive to speak about the crisis frankly, that if you tell people how bad things really are, if you're honest with them, that they will give up hope, that you need hope, you need to keep on telling people oh, it's bad, but it's going to be fine. There's this real wedding to this belief that unless you tell people it's bad but going to be okay, that they won't act. And I think that's just, well, I think that's completely false. It's dangerous. I think it's immoral to do that. And frankly, I think it's from a place of utter cowardice. It's not from a place of, it's because scientists don't want to say uncomfortable things. No one wants to say uncomfortable things. Most of the people, if not everyone on this call is an activist. So we say uncomfortable things all the time. And we do it because we believe in it, right? But we also do find it uncomfortable, right? I do it all the fucking time, but still, it's still uncomfortable. Scientists suck at this, to put it extremely gently. They suck. And so if it's a choice between saying something that's doesn't go against any power structures, which is an important thing. It doesn't say, oh, our current politicians aren't doing good enough. It just says, well, things are kind of generally fine, but we should be a bit nervous. They take the path of least resistance rather than having a good understanding of how do you change society. You don't change society fundamentally by lying. But yeah, and it's very patronizing, I should say. He's also really, really patronizing by scientists. Sorry, it's me and Tim. I normally play the bad cop, and Tim plays the good cop. No, so I normally kind of plays into the scientists a bit, and doesn't. I've left academia. Tim's still there. He can't badmouth his colleagues. I can. What was the point? Yeah, so it's also patronizing. There's kind of a view that, the populace. And maybe that's not so many, but so generally it's worse than we think. Scientists aren't telling us, are watering down that message themselves, and that's not even including, manufacturing consent and all the other kind of stuff. So yeah, scientists have got to get their shit together.
Thank you, Mike. I did feel at one point think I really want to reach out to these scientists and go, if you need to chat, you can. It's tough stuff, but yeah, you do need to take the next logical step and join us in rebellion. If you know this stuff, how can't you be? Yeah, I don't understand it, but it is difficult, and I really appreciate you telling your truth that, you know, we've got to get used to doing that. That's a big part of rebellion, and it is really uncomfortable. If anybody thinks I feel comfortable doing any of this stuff, you should see us behind the scenes. Candle maker, you had a question, I think you said. Did you come in?
Right, so Mike, excellent, thank you for that. Obviously, because we're a working class group, we've got to look at that angle as well, where scientists want to keep the jobs, don't they? And the people that are funding them, and whatever it may be, wherever the money comes from, whether it be lobbyists' money, whether it be government money, where normally I think it starts with government, doesn't it? And then everyone jumps on the bandwagon, especially in big pharma. Correct me if I'm wrong with that, yeah. So maybe it's like the government educates and funds the people like yourselves to do all the research. When they go, wow, we found this out, then suddenly, oh, the people that are funding you turn around and say, well, shut your fucking gob, like, because we don't want that. You know more than me about that trilogy of funding and keeping yourself in a job. A bit like the church as such. These people probably don't believe in God, but they do want to keep the jobs, if that makes sense. So there's that on the grants. And the lobbyists, as we are, I've been 30 years against lobbyists anyway, so I know exactly how lobbyists work and how they manipulate and how they twist and turn different stuff. I can name names, but there we are. So just on that angle type of thing, what's the chances of us onboarding, even though we've got lots of scientists anyway, I believe, onboarding more scientists and do a transition period of where they're not going to lose their jobs, not going to lose their livelihoods. Even though I know we're sort of, in Leon Chomsky's words, going off the end of the cliff for profit, but is there anything we can do about that? As in any form of respect, even like getting on the streets and trying to get scientists like more and more on board. Thank you.
Thanks, Candlemaker. Yeah, it's a social sciencey type question, isn't it? If any of you lads got any thoughts at all on it, it's yeah, how do we do that? That's what we spend all our time. What is stopping people from coming forward, especially people who know it? But yeah, it's a fear. Let's all go and rebel for UBI is where I end up when I wander down that question path. Why aren't people joining me? You know, we say because people are at work, they've got time commitments, you know, you've got to keep your job. I want to, yeah, march for UBI. Should we change group? Start a new one? Lads, have you got anything to say on that?
So is the question generally kind of how do we radicalize? How do we get scientists on the street? Broadly speaking.
That's what I heard. Is that right, Candlemaker?
Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah, how do we get on the street? So I've got it written down.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky. The way that we're trying to do it, did we even mention Scientist Rebellion? I don't think we did. So Tim and I co-founded this group, Scientist Rebellion, and Zach is like the major member or whatever. Yeah, so we think about this, and our main strategy is lead by example. There are plenty of scientists and people out there who say, yeah, we need to get on the streets. It's like, okay, where are you then? It rings hollow because it is hollow. So we think leading by example, being more radical. So there are other groups who take a very moderate leaning towards this and try to kind of onboard scientists in a very gently hand-holding, you know, being really kind of, I don't know, I think giving them a bit too much time. Whereas we're kind of like, no, we've got a job to do. You're also a human being. And you've lost all credibility as a scientist by not acting. Because if you tell people the room's on fire and then you don't act like it, then who the fuck should believe you? No one should believe you. And people don't, right? People generally don't believe the scientists. And that's because they're not doing sacrifice. they're not being arrested, they're not going on hunger strike, they're not going to prison. So the way we want to get them on the streets is by kind of making this message clear, that the way to kind of regain your credibility in an emergency scenario is by putting something on the line, putting skin in the game, acting like a human being, by leading by example, by being arrested ourselves. Like I'll be going to prison next week as well, so like trying to get like shift the Overton window, as it were. Cheers, Tracy. Trying to shift the Overton window about what's normal, and like a unrelenting commitment to the truth. Like the truth is the most important thing, and just not like an uncompromising thing about the truth. So like we clearly call for revolution, which is like the obvious thing that you should be doing right now. So I think being like bold, courageous, hopefully trying to get our argument out there properly. We've also got a few like funky strategy tactics which aren't so interesting, but broadly I think that's our like vibe. Tim?
Unrelenting commitment to the truth. I love that. Yeah.
Hope that. Yeah, that's true. Tim, can you correct me when that's right?
In my experience, at least most scientists, they want to do more. They want, they appreciate that something has failed in the system, but it's very difficult to see within a system what it is that you're doing wrong. It's really hard to see something from the outside when it's everything you know. And so sometimes it takes people just kind of smashing down the doors of that idealism and saying, look, this is where we've gone wrong. And as Mike touched on, would any kind of climate change denialism have been able to take hold if at the first sign of that, the scientists had just said, fuck that, we're not working, we're not doing anything you say, and if you continue with this is insanity. We take a kind of multi-phased approach. There's a few things that there's a lot of scientists who you can convince. We think that just by leading by example and by just talking to people and saying, look, we're doing this on these dates, come and join us. There's quite a lot of people who actually, there's a lot of willingness in the community to get involved. Other people need to be shocked, I think. And so one of the things that we do is we actively go to scientific institutions, we target scientific institutions to try and compel them to call on their membership, to call on their readership, whatever it may be, to say, look, the problem at the heart of the climate crisis, the problem that leads to climate inaction is political corruption. And we have to state that openly and loudly. So just all it takes, I'm trying to remember the quote, but I can't quite remember it. Something about shadows and light. All it takes, but sometimes, lies, untruths require darkness to operate. All it takes is exposing them to the light of truth. It's a bastardization of a quote, but it's near that.
We'll find it and make it into a meme, because this promotional stuff can be hard. Right? Candlemaker, you want to come back on how they answered your question there, darling?
A few questions I've been asked is, because we're part of permaculture as well, we've got permaculture sites dotted around, and do you think we're going to make it for permaculture? It's a slow progression, we are trying, but if we sort of run out of time for permaculture to make any kind of difference in this, does that make sense to you?
Of course it is. It's vital. The work you do in our communities keeps me going out on that front line, not knowing there's people in the building these resilient communities behind me. Sorry. Emotional. Yes, of course it's bloody important. But what do the scientists think about that? Sorry. Yeah.
It's just questions that have been asked to put forward because people can't hear at this point in time. Anybody
doing the building resilient community stuff, trust me, it's really important. That doesn't mean that those of us who are doing this are doing the wrong thing. Please stop having a go at us. It's hard work that we're doing too, but both are vital. And for me, it's reassuring seeing what's going on in our communities and little pockets all over the world. It's bloody beautiful.
I mean, I think permaculture is extremely important for a number of reasons. The first reason is that it just builds community resilience, and it gets people talking to each other again, and it gets people connected with their food systems. We are so completely detached from our food systems, and that's the reason we have so much clearing of rainforest. That's why we have, a massive amount of pesticides used, which are causing, insect apocalypse. It's because we're not connected to our food system. So I think arguably the most important part of permaculture is actually getting that connection back and building up soils and building up resilience. I would also argue as well that one of the most important things in terms of our food system is to move away from animal agriculture. Animal agriculture is extremely, in most instances, extremely harmful for the environment. There are some practices that can be good for the environment, but currently on the scale that we're farming animals, we're clearing lots of rainforest, we're causing new pathogens to evolve. I mean, lots of zoonoses, like the coronavirus, that's a zoonose. So those are diseases transmitted from animals to humans through using antibiotics. We drive those through factory farms where animals are in really close proximity. We drive those as well. And the reason that there are problems with animals is because they're really inefficient at converting feed into food. So they use a large amount of land and a large amount of resources in order to convert calories into, the calories that we eat in the form of meat. So yeah, I would argue that we rapidly need to move towards permaculture and rapidly move away from animal agriculture.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. When you break the questions down like that, the way you explained it, it just seems so silly that we put so much resources into eating and the destruction. Thank you. That was really lovely. We have a question from Costa on the floor. There's a couple in the phone. I will come back to you, Candlemaker. We've got a couple in the bank. And Costa.
What got me initially into XR, and something which I think was really effective in the speaker tour that was going around in the early days, and is making clear that extinction applies to humanity. I think a lot of people outside of XR, they think it's just talking about mass extinction of species outside of humanity, and think, oh, of course, yeah, we should do something, but don't disrupt the roads or whatever. So then my thinking is, hang on, we're talking about humans like us as well. And I suppose my understanding is that we could potentially be talking decades rather than centuries. So that's another thing where it's like, if we think centuries, we think we can, kick the can down the road, we might have a technological fix. But if it's within decades, I mean, some of us alive today might see the end of humanity. Like that just seems crazy that it's not just focusing everyone's mind. So I think there's a bit of a job to do. And that's if I've understood it right, because I'm actually not a scientist. So that's, I suppose, something that I want to check when I tell people, am I saying this could be in decades? Is that accurate? And then I suppose the second part is, whilst a lot of evidence I know will be dotted around in academic works and the IPCC collected works, what are the best resources that we can go to say, look, I'm not just making this up and being scaremongering, this is actually backed up and this is a simple way to show it. And then the third part, sorry to hog the mic so long, is that I start talking about the processes that are linked with climate breakdown, like the melting of the polar ice cap and how that's increasing carbon in the atmosphere, and then things that we'll see, whether it's extreme weather events, killer heat waves, wildfires, drought, flooding, and everything. But I think the most effective thing I've found just from talking to people is saying, look, within decades, we're just not going to be able to grow the food that we need. And that's not just in one part of the world, that could be globally. So we'll have global crop failures, and that will be one of the factors which could mean that we all die out. So I suppose I'm just checking in, am I being accurate here, and what are good resources to go to, and what can we do perhaps as a movement to kind of really ram home the message? We're talking about human extinction possibly within decades.
Costa, thank you for voicing all three parts of them. They go together lovely. The raw data question is one that a lot of people, including my old man, really want to know. Yeah, the 2050 thing, It is shocking. I mean, I believe that that's where the science leads me to think we end up. Why don't people respond? Like I said at the beginning, 2050 even to me seems a way off, much further off than it would to Zach, you know. So which one of you lads want to pick this up first? And I really appreciate it, Costa. Even voicing questions is really tough. I could hear that emotion in your voice, and I'm grateful for you bringing it here tonight. Tim.
Yeah, fantastic question. You know, the first thing that I want to say, I guess, is that kind of a subtle point, which is that something can be true without being credible. What we believe about the world isn't really necessarily tied to what the world is that deeply. So that comes about for a bunch of reasons, and culturally within our society, there's an expectation. We look at the world around us and we see the incredible things that we've built and the incredible complexity of society, and it boggles the mind to think that something like that can be so vulnerable. So it can be true but not credible. I think you're absolutely right that humanity faces within my assessment of the sciences, that humanity faces an existential threat on the timescale of decades. I would qualify that by saying that you know, even I don't find it totally credible. I've been involved with Extinction Rebellion for two years or so. Something that Extinction Rebellion's done so well is to get that conversation moving, is to shift the Overton window towards talking about the possibility and the fragility of humans and human civilization. But still, I mean, there's something in your brain that says, well, you know, humans do have remarkable capacity, and there is truth to that. You know, humans, we have language, for instance. Language is it's so fascinating how important language is and what it allows us to do in the world. And so, you know, I think short of a kind of catastrophic nuclear war, I think some people probably would survive climate breakdown. It takes a real mess of affairs to actually kill everyone. But at a certain point, do we really care? You know, are we talking about 6 billion people dying or 7 billion people dying? And it's not inevitable that we get to that point. That is dependent on political choices, and as relating to the question about permaculture and you know, rewilding and things like that, decarbonization and various political solutions do exist to avoid that catastrophe. But I think that the way in which we make it credible is through political action. And now one of the reasons why Scientist Rebellion exists is because we think that if scientists who ostensibly know the most about the crisis, who know the most about what's coming, if scientists are on the street saying we absolutely will not take this, that makes it a lot more credible. So that's our kind of political response to it. I'm not sure if I've missed any part of it, but
I love it. True but not credible. I hadn't thought of it like that before. And I just quickly, before I bring Mike in, say, yeah, do we care? Everybody with you. And the only reason I'll answer yes, I bloody care is if some people are planning to save themselves in bunkers and they think they're putting the people who bought us in them bunkers, they're going to have to deal with me and my mates, because I'm not having that, right? You know, that makes me really angry. Yeah. Mike.
I just want to make one point based on that, and then I think we need to talk about like sources and things. I think that's really important. We haven't really spoken about that yet. Scientists are very used to, again, in a way they're conservative, is through the amount of evidence you need to speak about something. So the burden of proof is very high. So like in my area of physics, you know, it might be, I wasn't a particle physicist, but, you know, just to declare that the Higgs boson, which people, you know, the God particle that was recently discovered, the amount of evidence you needed for that was enormous, right? You had to build a really big ring under Geneva and all of that stuff, right? It cost loads of money. You need a ton of evidence. And that's fair enough, right? You want to be certain. So scientists are kind of in that mindset. But what we don't need that. we shouldn't only be panicking if we're 100% certain we're going to go extinct. We should be panicking if we're over 1% certain, I would say. And I don't think that any scientist worth their salt would say that we have less than, would say, you know, I think many scientists would say it's about 50-50, or maybe like 25% chance we're gone in decades, or civilization has collapsed and organized life as we know it. They would say, you know, it would definitely be like above % and stuff. So I shouldn't use this metaphor because we're talking about climate, but if you're flying a plane, if you're in a plane, just think of another example. You know, if you're flying in a plane, you don't only worry about problems which are 100% guaranteed to happen. If there's a 2% chance that the wing's going to fall off, you're pretty bloody worried about that thing. But right now we've got scientists being like, no, we're not sure the wing's going to fall off. And you're an alarmist if you talk about it. It's like, no, it's not fucking alarmist. It's being reasonable. So there's a really big tension between scientists want to be scientists are terrified of being called alarmist. And I think we all know why. It's because scientists don't want to be icky and weird. They don't want to be the weird kids on the playground, right? They've been bullied. Like most scientists have been bullied when they're kids. They don't want to be ostracized again. So they're terrified of being called stupid. So they will only back shit up unless it's watertight. And even those predictions are generally off because they're too conservative. So I would say, the question shouldn't be, are we going to go extinct? It's or civilized life collapse within decades. It's, is there like a reasonable chance of risk? And if it was 10% or 90%, I'm not sure we should be reacting very differently. And we're sure as shit above 10% risk.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah. That was a really good set of questions. So we're going to move on to the facts bit of it. So raw data. So how my dad put it was, what is it that you look at? Where can he have a look at it? Because, you know, we're all so untrusting. When you start to think that maybe this is real credible and you start looking for information, it's hard, isn't it? So who wants to take that bit?
It's a really difficult one, that, because, you know, so I have my views on what data I find useful and what sources I find credible, and I can tell you that I can tell you a bit about that if that's helpful. But I don't know how to prove that it's credible beyond just me claiming it to be so. So I mean, I'll put a couple of links in the chat so you can see. A couple of resources that I think collate the data and research really well, and you'll know some of them for sure. But it's really, I don't know how you go about demonstrating that that's credible. I guess a part of it can come out of a political analysis. So for instance, one of the reasons why the mainstream media isn't especially credible is because of its ownership. It's because of its function in society in terms of who it represents and who it serves. And so you can get a sense from those political relationships about why something would be saying, taking one position or another. But that's a very difficult thing to kind of assess objectively or independently. But bodies like the NOAA, like NASA, like Carbon Brief, I think there are some really good organizations who I personally think are absolutely credible, and the scientists that are trying to do good work. The data itself, you have to know a little bit about how to interpret it sometimes, depending on, well, normally you have to know at least something about how to interpret it. But the data itself is harder to mislead with. As Mike said, there's this kind of conservative bias in science, so that can make it quite difficult to interpret what it is that's being said, and scientific papers are always caged in kind of language which is there's always a particular language to any community which is really hard to understand from outside of the community. So that's something that scientists fail in completely, that we don't communicate. We've allowed ourselves to become diverted towards thinking, how do we get the most publications, instead of how do we impact society? And to me, that's the goal of science. Yeah, so not a particular, I don't think that's a very good answer, but it's a really difficult question.
Yeah, no, I like that answer. That made sense to me. There are, I mean, it's everywhere. You can, yeah, defence companies, all it's World Wildlife Fund, Wikipedia, climate denial, and climate change. You know, there is an abundance of information, but it's looking into it. Mike?
I want to say one thing briefly that is in defence of science to make a bit of a change of tune. So I do occasionally see, so because I kind of criticise science and activists and stuff, I am conscious that some people might think, I don't know, that I'm claiming that the science is made up, and that is not at all the case. There is not this kind of, scientists aren't like paid to write articles. There isn't kind of smoky back rooms where figures are fudged and stuff. The kind of reasons why these things are happening is just like sociological biases. It's not like, scientists work really bloody hard and they're really passionate, and they generally have always been passionate about it. So yeah, I just want to make it clear that we're not claiming that there's any kind of probably there's so much like corruption in other fields, almost all fields, because of money, but I would say financial kind of corruption within science is generally not a thing. Maybe within like big pharma you could argue some certain things, but not within climate science.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It is, yeah, we're not here to bash any scientists. You know, all of the bloody professions aren't standing up, aren't they? Teachers know this stuff. Lawyers annoy me far more than scientists who aren't standing up. You know, plenty of professions. Don't start me on politicians. So I've seen another chat in the, so I will come to you again, Candlemaker. Chris is asking, how can scientists act to counteract the dreadful fake news and eroded belief in science that is rising so dramatically, isn't it? Because this is allowing people to shut out the climate facts. Yeah, it's a good point. How do we counteract the propaganda? I think that's what these lads are here tonight doing. You know, it's radical truth telling, living in the truth and telling the truth. I think we all should do that. So how do we counteract fake news with science?
Enormously difficult question, particularly in the way that fake news is morphing and evolving in the social media age. So yeah, in one part of it, I think we've already tried to lay out a case a little bit, which is about, you know, how we can make science more credible by being political. You know, countering this tradition in science that says to be credible you have to be objective and detached and apolitical. We're saying that's just not true for something where your life is at risk. Being detached in that circumstance is wild. No one believes that. And another part of it is more difficult. Wherever you look in society, any systems, there's always scientists behind the scenes somewhere. So if we're talking about fake news in social media or something, somebody designed the algorithms there. Somebody with a science degree is working on those mechanisms and on those processes. And a part of the thing that has made a lot of these issues come to light are whistleblowers, are scientists being brave enough to come forward to risk their own their employment, their safety sometimes, and to say, this is what's happening, this is how you are being manipulated, and this is politically the cause. So we need to encourage more scientists to be courageous in that kind of way, so that people can understand it. But it is a really complex question. I am encouraged by how much movement there has been on climate issues in recent years. Climate denialism, it's grotesque how long it managed to maintain a control. And within subsets of the society, particularly within the political classes, it's still extremely powerful. But within the population, the vast majority of people now understand that climate crisis is real, it's caused by humans, and there is a growing appreciation of the existential threat to do with that. So it's a big problem, but we are making headway. We're winning that argument. We just need to win it fast.
Thank you, Tim. I think it is the truth telling, back to truth telling again, and being transparent. You know, these scientists putting their faces and their voices behind their words as well as their actions. All of that is really important for me. I can't stand seeing all these people talk at me the same way, and I can hear bullshit coming out their mouth, and you feel that in your heart, don't you? I'm being lied to, and you feel in your gut that something's not quite right. So for me, I'm just really drawn to all the truth telling people who are uncomfortable when making others uncomfortable. Zach?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this fully answers the question, but for me, I think the most important thing about fake news is understanding why people spread it and why people engage with it. So, you know, if someone, for example, you know, animal agriculture is really, really controversial, and there's a lot of farmers who are saying, oh, there's nothing wrong with farming, you know, beef and dairy farming. And of course, this is their livelihoods, and they've been forced into this in order to survive. And, you know, if there's mistruths being spread around, you have to look where that comes from. And ultimately, it's the money system. People don't trust a lot of science, and there's this rise of kind of anti-intellectualism because it's associated with profit, because it's associated with big pharma. And that's why radical truth-telling is really, really important, because it's saying, no, look, this system is really, really problematic, and we need to counter that. And if we radically tell the truth, people will believe that. People don't like, you know, this shady business. So yeah, maybe it doesn't answer the question, but I think it's just really important to understand why people share these kind of things and come at it from their perspective.
Does anybody know how a council sort of says, well, we're carbon neutral, or it's so many tons of CO2, you know? Where on earth do they get that information from?
I don't know the answer to that. I can guess that you can do a calculation based on energy consumption in the area, and similar other factors like that, and just add up each contribution. Would be my guess, but I don't know.
I could be wrong here, but I think that's measured using a thing called a Kaya identity. So what you do is you look at the population of the area, then you look at the like GDP, I guess, of the area. Then you multiply that by the energy intensity per GDP, and then you multiply that by the carbon intensity per energy intensity. That's maybe kind of not a very helpful answer, but I think it's about breaking things down into kind of averages. So you could question, you know, how reliable they are, because there's a lot of variation.
And it depends, like, is the council, are they talking about like for their area, or are they talking about just the council? Because sometimes they'll do that and they'll just say like, oh, so that just means like, oh, fleet of cars, which frankly is not that, you know, not important, but it gives the implication that they're doing something much grander where they just talk about their own buildings and stuff. At least that's what's happening around me. So yeah.
Thank you.
Politicians being deceptive, who would have thought so?
Who would have thunk that that would be a thing? I've just seen in the chat, Lunchy Munchies put, wouldn't it be amazing if there was a resource where you could go to look at these scientists and there'd be a little bit of them talking to camera explaining what their credentials are and what they see. And I think, yeah, that's what these guys have started doing. So we encourage all scientists. In fact, I encourage you all. I don't know how I ended up doing it. Well, I do. I wanted to talk to my kids. But yeah, that's really lovely. Was that the question from Alison that was just read out while I really professionally ran off and grabbed my charger? Have you got another one, Kevin?
Yeah, I've got another one here from John. Given Boris Johnson's new green 10-point plan that includes small nuclear power stations, is it time to accept that the only truly carbon neutral world would be a nuclear one?
Keeping them easy tonight, aren't they? I can see Mike going, no, not
no. It's opinions more than anything, isn't it? Yeah.
There are lots of different sets of choices you could make that can converge on a similar outcome. So it's not inevitable. There's no one path forward in the future. There are things about nuclear that I think it would be nice if people new though. So it's tricky because there's a few things that we should distinguish when we talk about nuclear, because you have nuclear weapons, you have nuclear fission reactors, and within them you have lots of different types of reactor, and you have nuclear fusion reactors, which are not yet, well, they don't really exist yet. I mean, they do exist, but they're not used for commercial power. First of all, there's kind of a misconception, I think, that is linked between nuclear power generation and nuclear weapons, particularly coming out of the Cold War. So there's an association of massive danger with nuclear power, which for the most part isn't well backed up by the statistics. I mean, statistically, if you look at energy generation, nuclear is one of the safest forms of power, as unlikely as that seems. Sometimes the truth isn't credible. It does turn out to be true that so far at least, nuclear has been one of the safest forms of power generation. And you can look at something like France, where they have 80 or 90% of their energy is generated by nuclear reactors. And in my view, so for France, that's worked very, very well. In my view, it can be a part of the solution going forward. You can take a mixed approach, and in my view, I think that would be a sensible short-term approach, but certainly not inevitable, and it's also not a long-term solution either, in my opinion. But again, yeah, it's quite an opinion-based thing when you're talking about decisions to be made.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, Zach.
Yeah, I might come in there. Again, this is, like, Tim and Tracy have said, this is like quite an opinion-based, question. And that's why we need citizens' assemblies. That's why we need to get everyone involved, because there's lots of stakeholders in this question. But I think a few things that this question raised for me is, the first one is about energy consumption, because you say, like, this is, is it nuclear inevitable? Well, I mean, that depends on what our energy consumption is like. If we want to keep increasing our energy consumption, then we're going to have to find a way to provide that energy. But, arguably, what we need to be moving towards is more of a degrowth model. So that's one question. And then another concern for me about nuclear is, well, historically it has been shown to be relatively safe environmentally. We need to consider the sort of future that we're moving into. And if we're moving into a future that is continually becoming destabilized politically, but also environmentally, we may see more extreme weather events that can cause damage to nuclear power plants, like we saw in Japan with Fukushima. So I think personally, I would be in favor of certainly a very low number of or no nuclear power, but ultimately the key for me would be we need to move towards degrowth in terms of our energy consumption.
Yeah, for what my tuppence is worth, that's why I want citizens' assemblies. I don't have an opinion on nuclear because I don't know enough, but my gut feeling tells me that's how we got in this mess. We're not considering them kids at 200 years. The half-life of this stuff is long, but eventually somebody will have to clean this shit up, unless, we make a complete mess of it in these next few years. Then they won't need to worry about it. That's a reason to be cheerful, isn't it? Yeah, thanks, Ads. Kev, have we got another question?
Right, yeah, I best go back to this one from Alison. I'm not sure what you're thinking about this one. So Alison says, I was at a Labour meeting recently where we discussed retrofitting, and it was advised that this involved cladding the outside of houses with polystyrene, which is not only flammable, but far from carbon neutral. Retrofitting has long been a main plank of the greening promises from Bristol City Council and others. I'm hoping you will tell us that my information is wrong and that retrofitting involves a much cleaner, greener methodology. Sorry.
I don't know about Bristol, and I can't speak to kind of the particularities of that context or of that example. In general, various kinds of retrofitting in terms of making things more efficient and more sustainable, I think that's absolutely a good thing to do. Any improvement the UK has made in terms of reducing its energy consumption comes from increases in efficiency, not decreases in power. It's it's not sufficient to tackle the problem, but it is a part of the problem. It's a part of the solution. Also, I mean, very few things are actually carbon neutral when you produce them. I mean, even, you know, renewable energy, solar cells or wind turbines or whatever, they have a carbon cost associated with them. They're still better because it's so much less carbon than something like fossil fuels. Although, as Zach said, you have to change the model that underpins the economics of the system, because else you just encounter the same problem. You just delay it by 10 or 20 years. The question really, though, isn't what is the carbon cost up front of this? It's more, what's the carbon cost over a lifetime? If it costs a bit of carbon, but it improves the efficiency sufficiently, it's probably still worth doing. Again, there's a kind of political question that underpins it, though. As I said, I can't speak to the council that you're speaking about, but you know, you don't have to look far to see kind of political problems around fitting or retrofitting houses to see how damaging that can be. I mean, the obvious example is Grenfell, where you have political motivations. Within there, you have monetary considerations, and you have a disregard for poor and working class people, which causes social murder. Be clear on that, it's social murder. So in a case by case, I suppose you can see what, you can try and understand what are the motivations of the council. Are they outsourcing it to private contractors? If they are, there's a good chance, in my view, that they're going to be motivated to cut corners, to save costs. And that's just the rational economics that we're told is a good thing. But it leads quite directly to those kind of social breakdowns. And so you can get a hint, I think, as to the reality of the situation by examining the politics of that.
It's really following on from all the things you said, but I'm coming back to this bit about what it takes to get through to people who don't get it. You know, I do talk a lot to people, and I'm very aware that, you know, if something is not real to them, it's not immediate to them, they don't get it. And unfortunately, people aren't always moved by, you know, the ice melts or the fires or the droughts elsewhere, because it doesn't impact on them. So what I always try and come back to, things you have mentioned, are things that are specific to the UK. And if in that great idea of having, you know, short bits of scientists talking to camera, if you're able to really hammer home what is very likely, I mean, I know they can't be facts, but what is very likely to happen to the UK within 2 years or within 5 years, you absolutely need to bring it down to what's immediate. I've just had a little conversation with Kevin about the flooding bit. I mean, I live in an area that is prone to flooding, but I still think that if people don't live in an area that is prone to flooding, after, you know, a few months and it's summer and the weather's good again, the impact of that dissolves, and they don't really still see it in climate crisis terms. So it's how on this earth we actually make it real to people in the UK. And that was really, you know, if they were going to do that to camera, I'd love them to include anything they can like that.
I'd love to see everybody doing it, Zach.
I think one way we can really bring the climate and ecological crisis home is by thinking about the coronavirus. This has had a massive impact on people's lives, and many people know people who have got COVID or have died from COVID. And ultimately, you know, pandemics are a sign of a global ecological system that is under strain, you know? So if we continue on the same path, it means that we're going to be dealing with more pandemics, because more infectious diseases will be released from cutting down rainforests, etc. But even just more on a material level, I think a lot of people remember, you know, back in March, not being able to get flour, right? This is, you know, food security is really, really important. And when we look at the wheat harvests this year in the UK, they were down 40% compared to average because of extreme weather. You know, so that's another way we can bring it right home, because we all remember not seeing flour on the shelves in supermarkets.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. I do. I think COVID has bust so many holes in the stories that we've been buying and building, and we need to, you know, step into that and start asking the questions and making the connections. And, you know, this stuff staring us in the face, isn't it?
on the bright side, right, hope and visioning. Because I'm getting it from my workmates, and this is a working class group, and hopefully it's going out to a working class audience. And I speak to working class people every fucking day, because I'm a working class man. And when they speak to me about it, and they do speak to me about it, they're more concerned about Wetherspoons jump on the 2nd of December than they are about us all dying. So as in for hope and visioning, what insight can you give us about that, please? Thank you.
I think that the climate movement has a lot to answer for in terms of its messaging. It is like when people say it's middle class and out of touch and elitist, there's a lot of truth to that. There are a lot of environmentalists who look down their nose at working class people. It is fucking true. Not all, but there are. It's definitely a thing. And we've all seen it, right? So I don't blame people who to like hate my guts at all, right? But then, so how do you kind of regain credibility? Well, what's the one thing that everyone knows? That like politicians and the elites are corrupt. Everyone fucking knows that, right? Everyone can agree on that. Unless you're one of them or you're one of their lackeys or useful idiots, in which case you think the sun shines out their ass, but fuck those guys, right? So what I'm trying to push for is that scientists take a much more anti-elitist vibe, because the elites are carrying out genocide of all people and most species on Earth. So we've got a common enemy. Sorry, this is a lot rambling way of saying we have a common enemy. Day to day, the elites are, oppressing and subjugating and exploiting everyone, especially working class. But what we're talking about is like the end crime of murder and rape and everything else that will go along with social collapse. So I think we need to kind of come together, hopefully, and be like, the person you fucking hate is the person we fucking hate. We might hate them for different reasons. It's really hard to make that argument because a lot of people have been really out of touch for a long time. And yeah, for lots of like boring political reasons. But yeah, generally that's what I'm trying to push for, is that there's much more this kind of like Occupy anti-establishment vibe within the climate movement, so that people will take us seriously who are working class.
There's an analysis of class power and class dynamics, which is completely lacking from enormous parts of politics, but especially, in the environmental movement. But it's crucial. And that question of who makes political decisions, and how does your interests, your social interests and your social class influence the decisions that you make. So that's why I think it's important that we're pushing for representation of typical people. Typical people are the ones who should be making the decisions, because they understand what is needed in their lives. So there is a part of the answer to the political breakdown that causes climate breakdown is that redistribution of power and wealth, which can actually be an enormous part of dealing with these issues. I didn't word that very well, but
for me, I love XR, they woke me up to it and that, but there was something a little bit missing. The climate crisis, it's a symptom for me. It's the final fucking mess of a symptom of a great bigger problem that we need to address. And I'd like to just big up XR a little bit. I happen to know there's a group of people really trying to work on this at the moment and work out how we organise going forward. There's loads of stuff going on all over XR and good people. And yeah, we've got a lot wrong, but we're here and we've got to keep working together. Lunch said he's had a load of stick on building sites being environmentally aware. Lots of people now think I'm alone. People probably did before, but yeah, it's uncomfortable telling the truth. Julian, you wanted to make a point, and I want to let you know what to do next.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question or say two things. I appreciate the last point, by the way, but I'm just going away from it here. Okay, it's basically in the same area. I've been wanting scientists to just come out, because it's quite, I think, like you're saying, if it's only a 10% chance of us getting extinction or thereabouts, it's still alarming, and when I investigated this, I was told that they have been threatened. There have been lots of threats to their families, which is very alarming. And I would like to know a little bit about that. But my other point is in this same area, and I don't know, it's not for scientists' role really, but it could help. There seems to be two, on social media I've seen so often, the two responses to this. I'm not talking about people who deny it and stuff. Either, oh, it's not that bad, or it's terrible, we're all fucked, we deserve it. And it's bypassing, whereas the David Attenboroughs and the Greta Thunbergs, I think, are in that painful middle, like I think the three scientists we have here, and perhaps everybody else, yes, a lot of it as audience, that it is awful, but there still is a possibility. I mean, this is David Attenborough's point at the end of his films. You know, we're taken through awful scenarios, and the last 10 minutes you feel a little bit more at peace because you think, oh, there's something we can do. And I think scientists and other people, it's not just their job to sort of plant something that's in the truth as far as we can see it. So and so for everybody, including all types of social class, so we just know the truth, because this is XR's point, is the information from the excellent science isn't coming through to the general public, not just in this country, but in Brazil, in African countries and elsewhere. And I know I could go on more about this, but I'm aware we haven't got much time. But I really would encourage, not necessarily you three, but your colleagues, just get out there and, you know, be charismatic or whatever, because you know you'll be heroes at the end. And it's and I really respect the scientists, the way, but it's so polite. They keep saying the same thing, same data, and it's all beautiful. But there's that, you know, that vitality of just, you know, there must be one of you who can get out there and say, hey, you know, this is not okay. And I know you kind of mostly feel that, but just to get out there, as long as it's safe, you know, that's very important.
So the lads have done an action. They went to Nature and they printed off the, sorry, I'm gonna just quickly swap it up. Lads, would you like to just explain the social science bit of non-violent direct action, a little bit about what you've got coming up next week, and I'll sort out the cats and come back. And I'm really sorry.
So our first action was at the Royal Society. So the Royal Society is the Royal Society is kind of the oldest, the oldest and most prestigious scientific institute in the world. It's very fancy, and all the kind of major scientists have been fellows and members and whatnot. And we threw paint at the building, and we knocked on and were arrested. And then the second action we did was at the journal Nature, which is probably the biggest scientific journal around. And as Tracy started to explain, we printed out scientific papers that they had published and about the crisis, and attached them to the building, though we weren't arrested for that. They decided not to arrest us. So the idea behind that was kind of to show the truth back at them and be what our demand is we are demanding that scientific bodies endorse civil disobedience as the only practical and moral way to act in the current context. And that might seem, I think people would probably think, well, that's never going to happen. Like that would be, you know, unrealistic. If we're not aiming for things that seem unrealistic, we're damn sure going to go extinct. That's for damn sure. So it might be unrealistic, but that doesn't really matter. That shouldn't matter. It's about like what would help the most. So what we're trying to do is mobilize scientists to act courageously, and we're not doing. There's a reason we went to the Royal Society. There's a reason we're going to Nature. We're kind of going, should we say, not helpful leather, but you know, we're going for it because, you know, the world's on fire. We've got to act. We can't just have had like an hour and 15 of talking about how terrible things are and then act as if an A to B protest is anything less than, yeah, words don't describe how stupid that would be. So we need scientists to sacrifice. So we have like a real focus on this sacrifice model, i.e. if you don't put skin in the game, you don't get anything. 2 million people marched against Iraq. Did fuck all, right? Imagine if 2 million, well, did very little. Imagine if, 1,000 people had done civil disobedience then, if they had risked arrest, that would have been it, maybe, at least there would have been a chance. What's happening now? So we started our kind of campaign against scientific bodies to make this point that it's something wrong at the heart of science. So it's not just about like corporate sponsorship of the Science Museum, which is wrong and shouldn't happen, but it's more than that. It's about scientists thinking that saying the room is on fire is sufficient. Like, if that's not enough, you haven't fulfilled your moral duty just by saying the warning. You have a duty, if you walk past a house which is on fire, you have more of you should ring the fire brigade, but you should also try and help, right? You don't just have a warning, you don't just have a duty to just be like, oh, house is on fire. Oh, you've ignored me. Don't worry about it, right? And we've been ignored for 40 years. Our strategy has failed. We are failing and we are not addressing this crisis. So we have to do the thing that we don't want to do, which is go and be arrested, go on hunger strike, go to prison. So now what we're doing is we're part of a campaign called Mobilise Peace, which started just today. And it's with a group that Zach and Ronan, who's not here, started called System Change. And this is targeting universities in Ireland and the UK. And as I say, the first action happened today. Probably one of the first announcements, and it happened this afternoon, that Ronan pulled the fire alarm at Trinity College Dublin and handed himself in after the fact to the police. There are other people who will be taking action in Ireland, I won't say where, and there'll be actions also happening in the UK, and this is all happening over the next 10 days.
There's the general point, of course. Many people know it, but we were just talking about the possibility of hope for resolutions to this, and I think the general point about why MVDA can work and that historical analysis of when it has worked is really important for people to hear and to understand, because mass campaigns of civil disobedience have brought down democracies, they've brought down dictatorships. They have been successful more than half the time in achieving their goals, and they're way more successful than non-violent ones, both in terms of how likely they are to achieve their goals and in what comes next, whether or not that is a decent society that you want to live in. So it's very easy to be apathetic and to think, look, the forces arrayed against us are just too much. But empirically, that's not true. As scientists, we can look at the data and say, do we have a chance here? And I think the answer is yes. It's not easy, it's damn difficult, but we do have an opportunity here. We can make that difference.
I have maybe a slightly unconventional view that, because I think this fatalism thing's really important, because people go, you could have started hearing us ramble on and be kind of optimistic, and then heard this talk of decades and collapse and be like, oh, well, now I won't act. I'm now fatalist. I'm I've given up. And it's totally understandable, right? To go from, you don't know much, then you know a bit more, you're like, holy shit. So how do you stay in that sweet spot? For me, I think it's about, it doesn't matter how small the chance is. It doesn't matter. You wouldn't give up on your family members if it was oh no, they've now got some small % chance of them living, switch it off, right? You wouldn't do that. And we're not talking about 1 or 2 family members, we're talking about everyone. So I think trying to detach yourself from what the chances are, and even in quite a dark way to kind of end quite dark, cool. Even if you are to say it's all lost, and I think there's a very good chance that we do have no chance. The reason I continue fighting anyway is we can still help, if this is our swan song, if this is our final show, then let's try and make it as not horrible as humanly possible. Like if we're about to see kind of horrible forces be unleashed, then this is the time where we have to rise up more than ever. It doesn't matter if it might be that we don't win this battle. The least we owe everyone around us is to make it, it's like palliative care. We've got to do everything we can. We should feel like a moral duty to do this. It shouldn't just be, oh, well, it's too late, give up. Anyway. So,
thanks.
Not very relevant, but really important, I think.
No, it's lovely. I did the funny face because, it didn't do much in England, the marches against Iraq, but Egypt did rise up on the back of seeing us doing it. So we don't know. You don't know who you're affecting, what you're affecting. And if you haven't heard, I've got Real Hope Chile a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, they've done it. They've been protesting. They're rewriting their constitution. They're doing it equal, Yeah, even if we're going down fighting, right?
Yeah, I don't really have too much to add, to be honest, other than that it's been really, really great to hear your questions and to debate it and think about it. And I would just encourage people to, I presume everyone on this call is already involved, but if you're not, please, message our group or XR Working Class or someone and do something, please. Because we all not acting is just not an option anymore. But yeah, that's all I have to say, really.
Let's just start having these tough conversations, asking questions, going out and making a fuss and demanding citizens' assembly. But most, let's just keep asking the questions.
There are often predictions of extinctions that are expected to happen, but how much biodiversity has been lost to date? That's the first part of you.
That's a really difficult question to answer. And to be perfectly honest, the scientists don't know how much we've lost to date. There's a massive amount of biological diversity out there, particularly in insects. And we only think that we've, discovered about 20% of all the insect species. So still 80%, of insect species haven't been described. And it's really sad, but we are losing species faster than we can actually count. So I can't give you an exact percentage because there's just not enough scientists out there naming them because it's a really slow process.
In terms of the numbers of, correct me if I'm wrong here, Zach, you're the biologist, you know better than me. In terms of species lost, that was my understanding as well. But my understanding is that in terms of the numbers of creatures killed, I believe the number is at about 70% of the animals, fish, birds, reptiles, and somewhere between 50 and 80% of the insects, depending on the populations and where you look. It needs to be more research done. So around 70% of all of those have been killed. So we're looking at a decimation of populations. That's my understanding from what I've read. Is that accurate, Zach?
See, the thing is, there's a number of different definitions of biodiversity. So it's kind of hard to say explicitly because, by biodiversity, you could just say species number, and in terms of, species number, perhaps we haven't lost, 70%, but another description of biodiversity is volume as well. And it's considering, just the number of individuals and the number of species and how those two things interplay. And based on that definition, I could well believe that it could be 70% lost.
An important thing to kind of note, I think, is that whether we're talking about, if it's 50% or 40% or 70% or whatever it is, that is an effect that will be felt for millions of years. I mean, particularly when you're talking about the eradication of species, that's lost forever. I mean, once that's gone, it's just gone. So the only kind of, I think the only adequate comparison to the effect of humanity over the last few decades is that of an asteroid impact or a super volcano eruption.
This is a little bit off topic, but it kind of comes back to an earlier question about, why should we care if, oh, we lost this species of insect, like who really gives a shit? But one thing that's really important to remember is that ecosystem health is human health. Like I think there's something that, isn't talked about much. And I think that's why, a lot of, environmental activists are, called tree huggers, because they're like, oh, it doesn't matter, people aren't going to die. But like the health of our ecosystems is our health, because we need them for our food systems. We need them for protection against, natural disasters. Like corals provide massive, protection against things like storm surges. So yeah, again, goes back to an earlier question, but we should care about, species loss that isn't our own, because like all, living things are connected.
That was lovely, Zach. Yeah, thank you. Kev, would you like to read the second part of Peter's question?
I'll read it out. I don't fully understand it myself. But anyway, CO2 and methane leave the atmosphere at different rates. Is it likely that the rates of absorption of the gases will improve or get worse? Feedback effects.
If I've understood correctly, then the question basically is asking about, so for instance, methane naturally breaks down in the atmosphere. It has a potent lifetime of something like 20 years, maybe 30 years. Not sure of the exact number. And during that time, it's about 70 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of its greenhouse effect. But CO2 as well, CO2, so that can be absorbed by plant life, by trees. It can be absorbed into the oceans. So I think the question is saying, we're pumping lots of CO2 up. Is the atmosphere reaching some kind of natural limit? Are those reserves of carbon reaching their natural limits? And so if that's correct, then, well, the first part of it links to what Zach was just talking about, biodiversity, is that life is an enormous carbon sink and we're decimating it. So if one of the most powerful things you can do to slow climate change is to restore ecosystems, particularly things like rainforests. But not them exclusively. They're enormous, really unexpected carbon sinks actually as well in nature that need to be protected for our own sake. So in terms of whether or not that is going to get better or worse in the future, all of the indications are that that's getting worse at the moment. I'll give the example that the Amazon rainforest is kind of, we don't know exactly when, for kind of complex reasons about the amount of moisture that trees add to the atmosphere and what that does to local environments. The Amazon is at risk of collapse if we do too much deforestation there. So that's kind of one obvious example of the estimates of when that threshold exists, that actually the air becomes too dry because you've cut down too much of the rainforest, and so the rainforest collapses. It's a bit simplistic, but something like that. That's estimated to be at about 20 to 40% deforestation, and we're at around about 20% now. So it's another one of those thresholds where we're just on the cusp of potentially going past that point of no return. So there's real risks there. On a kind of interesting scientific note, more broadly, if you look at the historical record of the climate, you see that last time there was this much CO2 in the atmosphere, there were rainforests in Antarctica. Temperatures were much warmer globally, a couple of degrees warmer than now. And so eventually you do get that kind of, or you would hopefully expect to see that kind of a back reaction within the global system, which kind of naturally forms a new equilibrium. and a part of that can be the fact that forests extend to places where you didn't see them before. So I just find that fascinating on like an abstract level. It's unfortunately, we're talking thousands of year timescales there, so it's not particularly useful, but it is interesting.
Thank you so much, Tim. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, you're all still in this room here. The lads are out this week. Please find their page on Facebook. It's Scientist Rebellion. Please share the actions that they're doing and look out for what they're doing. Please keep asking questions. Yeah, I've run out of steam. You know, I was kind of dreading this one, talking about the science, but it's been lovely doing it with people who, you know, get it, feel the emotion, still have a laugh about it, and are going to go out and keep on fighting, right, even though we know all this. So thank you guys for coming. Thanks to everybody who came and sat in this room.